Professor Bird, thank you for being here. Can you share a time when you changed a long held belief and what influenced that change?
I find myself often changing my mind about things. However, on important long held matters, I tend to be fairly circumspect in forming beliefs in the first place. I don't find myself changing important beliefs that much because I tend to think that the world, especially that bit composed of people and their doings, is complex and not easy to get right in the first place. Yes, I tend not to avoid disappointment by not forming too many very strong and clear and definite beliefs about such things. But reflecting on that made me realize that coming to realize that point itself required me to give up a set of beliefs that I think I did have that one might regard as optimistic Enlightenment beliefs I did once hold. And so thinking about what those were, there were things like the thought that reason will ultimately win out over unreason, that political systems work by virtue of good design alone, or that liberal democracy is a resilient form of political organization that will, barring sudden catastrophe, always be able to resist internal challenges. So I think I've given up those beliefs that I optimistically once held. Yeah, looking at the recent history in particular, current history perhaps, suggests that these things aren't true and that moral, social, possibly even scientific progress, these things are not inevitable, that they don't benefit from a ratchet effect, and it's possible for these things to go into reverse. So I think that's a set of beliefs I've had unfortunately to give up and be a bit more pessimistic about them than I once was.
Are there any beliefs you feel you will never abandon and why?
Yeah, certainly. So many scientific beliefs, just choosing random, things like the theory of evolution by natural selection or the atomic theory of matter, the efficacy of many vaccines. Yeah, so loads of beliefs like that, I think. I can't imagine ever abandoning those beliefs. They're just too well attested by the evidence. It's true that very old scientific theories have been rejected. And of course, in the process of cutting edge science, where people put forward new ideas, we find those ideas sometimes after further investigation aren't any good. But on the other hand, it's rare in modern science that really well-established theories are abandoned. Sometimes the details are modified, but the core ideas remain. So the case of theory of evolution, yes, there's this development of epigenetics and so forth, and other sources of evolutionary change, such as drift and so forth, enter the equation. But the idea that much of evolution is being driven by natural selection is a sort of core idea that I don't think anybody will ever reject, or at least, as it were, given what I was saying earlier, that I won't ever reject that idea. Perhaps there will be civilizational collapse and people will stop believing it, but I won't during my lifetime, that's for sure.
I think, would you say scientific theories like theory of evolution would be considered knowledge instead of just a belief? I think knowledge can sometimes be defined as justified true belief, but I think my question was more targeted towards those beliefs which you don't really classify as knowledge, but you still feel very strongly about.
I'm a very strong believer in liberal democracy, but does that mean that I think that there are no circumstances under which political liberties should ever be infringed? Well, no. I mean, if the circumstances are extreme enough, then one might have to infringe upon some of the core ideals of liberal democracy, in order to maintain the existence of civilization or maintain the existence of liberal democracy itself. So even in the Second World War, quite a lot of liberties were given up in order to defeat Nazism and so forth. So I won't give up the thought that ultimately legitimacy for a political system comes from the acquiescence of the people over which that system operates, but that ultimately is quite a hedged kind of view. So there aren't things that I don't think I would ever give up, except the very hedged versions of those I won't give up. But they're so hedged that in some senses that's an easy call. That's right, yeah.
What do you think it means to disagree well?
Arguing and disagreeing are sort of processes, typically. There's a sort of back and forth between the arguers. So a good argument is one that aims at getting to the truth. But they don't always end in agreement, let alone agreement on the truth. So you get arguments where there's remains disagreement at the end, and therefore, by definition, there can't be an agreement on the truth. But nonetheless, both sides can be better off epistemically than they were at the beginning. They might be closer to the truth. They might be better off in other ways. So, for example, a good disagreement is one that even when there is remaining disagreement, there's, for example, shared understanding about what that disagreement really is all about, what the disagreement consists in, and why they're disagreeing. That's not a trivial point. People can often misrepresent to themselves what the other person is saying. Indeed, sometimes the people misrepresent their own views and motivations for why they're taking the position that they take. So a good argument or good disagreement is one in which people end up, even if they're not agreeing, at least understanding accurately why their opponents take the view that they do, what exactly their view is and what their reasoning for it is, and indeed understand their own view and its motivations better. So a good debate or a good process of disagreement would be one in which people know why they're disagreeing, knowing exactly what they're disagreeing about. Is your interlocutor really saying what you think they're saying? Such an argument should show a reasonable degree of charity. That is, you shouldn't put the worst possible interpretation on what the other person is saying, when a more sensible interpretation is just as consistent with their words. They should avoid, a good argument should avoid ad hominem arguments, unless those are clearly relevant to the context. And more generally, you avoid relying on rhetoric rather than evidence and reasoning and so forth. So, I mean, one way of thinking about what a good argument or a good disagreement is by contrast with what a bad argument and disagreement would be. And those are ones in which typically your one side, or perhaps both, aims to win the argument, where winning means getting the other side to concede or for an audience to back them and the other side. And if that's one's aim, one can think of TV political debates and so forth. If that's one's aim, then ad hominem arguments and other rhetorical devices will be used. The arguers will knowingly use fallacious arguments and so forth. And in that kind of process, their own understanding and the understanding of their audience won't be improved, and indeed probably quite the opposite.
Do you think there is any value in disagreement in terms of driving scientific progress or political progress?
Well, I guess if you've got the good kind of disagreement, then yes, because this is an old idea, you're going back to Mill and beyond, that it's the marketplace of ideas picture, whereby if you put many ideas out there and then debate them and you have people reasonably strongly putting them forward, but in this more cooperative disagreement kind of way, then you're more likely to end up with the truth. Whereas if you try to avoid disagreement, you may find yourself stuck with something that's false and you're putting forward alternatives for fear of disagreeing, then you may be stuck with a falsehood. So I think in this idea of Mills, and you find it in Popper and indeed in many others, that a certain kind of cooperative disagreement can be the way forward to better understanding, to the truth. It definitely seems to be right.
And my final question for you is, how can schools and universities promote good disagreement?
Yeah, this is an important topic. One thing not to do is to avoid contentious topics. I think that for many of these topics, you might think that, look, some of these debates become so toxic that your best thing to do is simply avoid them, right? A numerous issue that we could all think of quite that, we know that people disagree vehemently and often you get deeply upset about. And you might think, well, the best thing for schools and universities or other contexts is just simply to avoid talking about them. But I think that that's a mistake, because then people won't learn how to disagree well. I think it's rather better to confront such topics and to debate them in controlled conditions that are conducive to disagreeing well in the way that we've just been talking about. So I think there are lots of things that can be done to create such contexts. But I'll just mention just one that's relevant to the things that I do. So I think that understanding the nature of reasoning itself is helpful. So I'm quite a believer in courses on critical thinking. However, such courses tend to focus a bit of logic, and then also what are the fallacies, what are the logical fallacies and bad ways of reasoning. But often, as it were, the utility of that is presented as how to spot fallacies and failures in someone else's reasoning. And these kinds of courses, they're great, but they tend to miss out what I think is the most important feature of critical thinking, which is self-critical thinking. So an important component or ingredient in promoting good disagreement is to get to people to acknowledge that at least sometimes they can be wrong or can reason incorrectly, and that they should apply the lessons of critical thinking to themselves before they apply them to other people. So, for example, even amongst philosophers, I have seen some of them use arguments in, for example, politically charged debates outside a philosophical context, social media or whatever. And I find it rather depressing because they're using arguments that they would immediately see to be fallacious if presented in a philosophical context. And as it were, this change of context to something where it's outside the philosophy, it's outside the academic context, it's social media or whatever, and it's something which they feel strongly, suddenly their critical acumen just disappears, or at least it disappears as regards what they themselves are saying, though will still be there for what their opponents are saying. And I found that rather depressing. It was one of the reasons why I've abandoned use of social media. So I think all of us, and this includes philosophers, you need to, first of all, how to be self-critical thinkers, to acknowledge that we ourselves, at least sometimes, make mistakes and get things wrong. And sometimes we ourselves reason badly. And once we realize that, I think we will be better thinkers ourselves. We will be a little bit less judgmental about other people and their errors, or what we see to be their errors. And hopefully all round that will lead to us both better reasoning, even a more productive way of thinking about disagreement and disagreement with other people.